Welcome to Counter-Narrative News on Monday, 9th of January 2023, bringing you the daily news. Breaking news is that supporters of far-right former President Bolsonaro have invaded and raided the Congress building in Brazil. This is all in a context of Lula having won the election by quite close margin against his contender, Bolsonaro. This is also in a context in the region of a lot of different trends happening pertaining in a left-wing direction. For example, in Peru, there are still 50 blockades by protesters impacting the infrastructure, particularly the travel infrastructure of the country. They are protesting in support of former President Castillo, who was ousted on December 7th by right-wing President Bolsonaro. The protests in Peru, the protest last year in Colombia, which now sees a left-wing president there, and even the president in Mexico, who many claim is left-wing, despite his somewhat right-wing collaboration on the migration issue and others with his senior partner in the USA. But nonetheless, all of this points to an interesting moment in history, whereby the people, particularly the labouring masses of the region, are trying to assert themselves in defence of their right to their own wealth of their labour and that of their land. But the situation in Brazil is a right-wing provocative response against the re-emergence of the Lula project. Counter-Narrative News has been in touch with the Tawergha community today. The Tawerghans are from a town called Tawergha in North Libya near Misrata. Until 2011, some 35 to 40,000 residents lived in the town. But due to the NATO operation there and allied NATO proxies, for example, supremacist death squads from Misrata and other places, not least the so-called Brigade for the Purging of Black Skins, the entire town of Tawergha was wiped out. Tawergha was the only black town in all of North Africa. The Tawerghan community have informed us today that only 25% of the residents that existed there until 2011 have returned since the town had a somewhat relative opening up since 2018. However, many Tawerghan people feel very frustrated and full of anxiety and upset and trauma. Very much so, only 25% of the former residents have returned, indicating to exactly that. Also, the Tawerghan community in Britain are complaining that they are the only community from Libya who are not receiving any direct financial assistance as students in this country, whereas every other Libyan community does receive that. There's also frustration around the fact that the Tawerghan City Council representative, many Tawerghans feel, is not representative of their demands and their interests, and is in the pocket of the Misratan City Council, which are somewhat largely responsible for the vanquished nature of the town and the people there. Tawerghan people need a lot of solidarity, and it's one of the biggest scandals to have taken place in the entire Arab Spring moment, and particularly in the conflict in Libya in 2011. In China, workers at a pharmaceutical plant in Chongqing have rioted against police and authorities there. 10,000 workers are demanding proper pay, which has been withheld from them, and they've gone so far as to kidnap their boss until the demands are met. This is the second riot in 1 week in China. The previous one we reported on, when those who could not conduct firework displays because of police restrictions continued anyway and rioted against the police. Something seems to be shifting in China, because it's actually quite unusual for this frequency of rioting from the working class to occur there. Many reports are pointing to a renewed offensive by the Russian leadership in its conflict of invasion, occupation, and invasion based on a supremacist framework that Ukraine and Ukrainians don't exist. Many people are arguing that this new offensive is going to be in collaboration with the state of Belarus, who were also involved in the initial invasion and operation against Ukraine with the Russians back in February of last year. Also in related news, the new far-right government in Tel Aviv has indicated they are shifting towards the Russian position in the Ukraine conflict, when Tel Aviv had hitherto taken a somewhat independent, slightly leaning towards Kiev position. Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen has said he's going to talk less about the conflict in Ukraine, bringing many protests from Kiev. And also recently a former senior IDF spokesperson, a former IDF senior intelligence officer has argued that Russia facilitated the recent Israeli bombing of Damascus airport in Syria. This is nothing new, as Russia for nearly 10 years has facilitated and protected Israeli bombing raids in Syria, often against Iranian presence there. Also, it can be reflected on that Tel Aviv's supremacist and white supremacist colonization of Palestinian lands is very similar in its framework to the Russian supremacism, and it can even be argued that Russia has a form of Zionism and white supremacy in its framework and its operation in Ukraine. In South Asia, both Sri Lanka and Pakistan are struggling to secure a new round of investment from the International Monetary Fund. Pakistan has suffered devastating floods in recent months that killed 2,000 people, and Sri Lanka defaulted on its debts in spring last year, creating great social chaos and collapse, including end of the stockpiles of medicines in shops, of petrol in the petrol stations, and the total close down of the education system, triggering an incredible mass uprising against the ruling elite. In both these cases, Pakistan and Sri Lanka are close strategic allies for a long term now, with China. Beijing seems to be unable or unwilling or just impossible in its framework, in its international reach, to come to any serious assistance to the people of either Pakistan and Sri Lanka in this context. Indeed, especially in the case of Sri Lanka, the vast majority of the people there have an unfavorable attitude towards China, having seen China back its repression by the state and the political class, of which they've been struggling against its corruption and oppression and exploitation there. Many thanks. Please continue to subscribe, like, comment, and share. All the best.